Welcome to the Deep Dive. You, our listener, the curious learner, have sent us some fascinating material, and our job is basically to pull out the key insights, those surprising facts, and leave you feeling well-informed, without getting totally overwhelmed.
That's the goal.
Today, we're tackling something many thoughtful readers run into: these alleged contradictions in the Bible.
Right.
Our mission is to look closely at some specific claims you've highlighted and, see if we can bring some clarity.
Exactly. For you, the learner, it's about getting to the heart of things efficiently and hopefully having those aha moments where things just click.
Yeah.
So we're going to focus on 6 examples that people often bring up, and by doing that, maybe offer a way you can approach similar questions yourself.
Okay.
We'll look at things like differences in the order of events, numbers that seem a bit off, language that maybe feels out of time, and different reasons given for why people did things.
Sounds good. Let's dive in. First up is a classic one, maybe the classic, the order of creation.
Mm-hmm.
You look at Genesis chapter 1, verses 24 to 27, and it seems really clear. Animals came first, then humans. But then you flip over to Genesis chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, and it kind of sounds like Adam was already there before at least some animals were brought to him.
Yeah.
It feels like a direct conflict, right?
It definitely can look that way on the surface, but this is where getting into the original language really helps.
Oh.
The Hebrew word that gets translated as formed in Genesis 2.19, the word yatsar, it actually has a bit more nuance. Yeah, many Hebrew scholars point out it can, and in context often does, mean had formed, like something done previously.
Oh, like a pluperfect tense.
Exactly. Think of it like saying the chef prepared the ingredients versus the chef had prepared the ingredients. The second one tells you it happened earlier.
Okay. So instead of God whipping up those animals right there between creating Adam and Eve,
right,
it could mean God brought animals he had already created back in the sequence from Genesis 1 to Adam.
That's a very common and well-supported view. It fits the grammar and resolves the timeline issue neatly.
So the insight isn't really a Bible blunder, but more about, understanding that translation involves choices and words have ranges of meaning.
Precisely. And there's another layer too. Genesis 1 and 2 seem to have different goals.
How so?
Well, Genesis 1 gives you that big, sweeping chronological overview. Creation week, day by day. It's the outline.
Okay.
Genesis 2 then zooms in. It focuses particularly on the creation of humanity, Adam and Eve, the garden, their immediate world. It's providing more detail on that specific part of the story, not necessarily repeating the chronology.
Right, like one chapter is the wide shot, the next is a close-up on the main characters. They aren't contradicting, just different angles.
Some scholars even talk about Genesis 1 being chronological and Genesis 2 being more topical, focusing on the relationships God and man and woman, man and creation.
Interesting. Is there another way people look at this?
There is. Some commentators suggest that the animals in Genesis 2.19 were a special group, perhaps created right then specifically for Adam to name. The text doesn't explicitly say no animals were created after Adam was formed, just that creation was completed by the 7th day.
So multiple valid ways to understand it, none requiring a contradiction.
That's the key takeaway. Looking at language, purpose, and context often clears things up.
Okay, let's shift gears. Alleged contradiction number 7. This one feels like maybe just a simple counting mistake. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 10.8, says 23,000 Israelites died in one day due to sexual immorality.
Right.
But if you go back to the Old Testament account in Numbers 25.9, Moses records 24,000 died in the plague, links that same event. That's 1,000 people difference.
It is, and it jumps out at you. Now, some have tried linking Paul's number to a different event, like the golden calf incident in Exodus 32, because there was a plague there too.
But does that fit?
Not really. The golden calf was mainly about idolatry. Paul in 1 Corinthians is specifically warning against sexual immorality, which directly matches the context of Numbers 25.
Okay, so it's likely the same event. How do we account for the different numbers then? 23,000 versus 24,000.
The key seems to be in the details of how they're counting. Look closely at what Paul says. 23,000 fell in one day.
Okay, in one day.
Now look at Numbers 25. Moses gives the total figure, 24,000 who died in the plague. He doesn't specify the time frame for all those deaths.
So Paul could be giving the death toll for the single worst day of the plague.
Exactly.
While Moses gives the total number who died throughout the entire duration of the plague.
Precisely. It's entirely possible that 23,000 died on one catastrophic day and another 1,000 died on adjacent days or over a slightly longer period, bringing the total plague deaths to 24,000. Paul is highlighting the intensity of the judgment at its peak.
That actually makes perfect sense. It's like reporting battlefield casualties you might have, the total for the campaign, and then the number lost in a specific major assault.
A good analogy. Now, some sources mention a commentator who suggested Paul just, had a slip of the mind, misremembered the number.
Yeah, what's the issue with that view? Seems plausible on the surface.
The concern, for many theologians, centers on the nature of biblical inspiration.
Okay.
If Paul, who claimed his teachings came directly from God, he says so in places like Galatians and 1 Corinthians, if he could make simple, factual errors like mixing up numbers, well, where does that leave the reliability of the rest of what he wrote?
Right. It potentially undermines the idea that Scripture is divinely inspired and trustworthy in its details.
Yeah.
Peter even compares Paul's writings to Scripture.
Exactly. So the explanation focusing on the different time frames in one day versus in the plague is generally preferred because it harmonized the accounts without suggesting an error on Paul's part.
Got it. Okay, let's move to number 14. This one's about money, specifically a coin called daric.
Ah, yes, the darics.
1 Chronicles 29.7 mentions people offering 10,000 darics of gold during King David's time. That's around 970 BC. But the problem is, historians tell us darics were Persian coins, first minted much later, around 515 BC, under Darius the Great, centuries after David. So how could David's people have darics?
This is a fantastic example of a literary device called prolepsis, or sometimes anachronism, though prolepsis fits well here.
Prolepsis. Okay, break that down.
Sure. It's basically when a writer uses a term or concept from their own time to describe something from an earlier time, because that term is what their readers would understand.
So the writer isn't claiming the thing existed back then, but using a familiar word as a reference point.
Exactly. The writer of 1 Chronicles was likely writing in the 5th century BC after the exile, when darics were common currency in the Persian Empire.
Ah.
So when describing the massive amounts of gold donated in David's time centuries earlier, he uses the term daric because his readers would immediately grasp the value and scale associated with that coin. He's translating the value into contemporary terms for his audience.
Okay, like if I was telling a story about my grandparents buying a house in the 1950s and said it cost them the equivalent of, say, 50,000 euros today. Obviously, euros didn't exist then, but it gives a modern listener a sense of the value.
Perfect analogy. Or think about saying, my wife and I started dating. You call her your wife now, but she wasn't your wife then. You're using the current term.
Right.
The Bible actually does this elsewhere, too. Genesis mentions Abraham traveling near Bethel, but the place wasn't actually named Bethel until Jacob named it later in the Genesis story. The writer uses the later familiar name for clarity.
So the chronicler wasn't making a historical blunder about currency. He was communicating the amount of gold in a way his 5th century readers would instantly understand. The historical fact is the large gold offering, not the specific coin type.
Precisely. It's about effective communication across time, not a factual error.
Makes sense. Okay, contradiction number 21. This one's about motives matter, focusing on King Jehu.
Jehu's a complex figure.
He really is.
Yeah.
In 2 Kings 10.30, God actually praises Jehu for destroying King Ahab's wicked family, saying he did what was right.
Yes, fulfilling a command God had given.
But then you read the prophet Hosea chapter 1 verse 4, and God says he will avenge the bloodshed of Jezreel on the house of Jehu. Jezreel was where Jehu carried out that purge. So God praises him, then condemns him for the same thing. How does that work?
It does sound contradictory at first hearing. Now, one possibility mentioned is that Hosea's prophecy might refer to later unrecorded wicked acts by Jehu's descendants in Jezreel. That's possible.
Okay.
But the more common understanding, and one that fits the text well, focuses on the difference between Jehu's actions and his motives.
Ah, so God could approve of the act itself, getting rid of Ahab's incredibly evil regime, which God had commanded.
Yes.
But still condemn Jehu for why or how he did it, his personal reasons?
Exactly. Look at the verses right after God's commendation in 2 Kings 10. Verses 29 and 31 explicitly state that Jehu didn't turn away from the idolatrous sins of Jeroboam, the golden calves, and he didn't follow God's law wholeheartedly.
Right. He did this specific task, but didn't change his overall loyalty.
So while he obeyed the command to eliminate Ahab's house, his heart wasn't fully devoted to God. His motivation might have been mixed, partly obedience, perhaps partly political ambition, self-preservation, consolidating his own power.
It's like someone doing a good deed, but for selfish recognition, rather than genuine kindness. The deed is good, but the motive taints it in God's eyes.
That's a great way to put it. Compare Jehu to, say, Elijah confronting the prophets of Baal. Elijah acted out of a clear passion for God's truth and glory. Jehu's actions, while fulfilling a divine mandate, seem, as one scholar put it, like carnal zeal tainted with protective self-interest.
So God commended the obedience to the specific command, but later held Jehu's dynasty accountable for the impure motives and the continued disobedience in other areas that fueled those actions.
Precisely. It underscores a huge biblical principle. Motives matter deeply to God. It's not just what we do, but why we do it. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 13, doing amazing things without love profits nothing.
That adds a lot of depth.
Yeah.
Okay, fifth one, number 48. In what order did Satan tempt Jesus?
The wilderness temptations.
Yeah, Matthew chapter 4 and Luke chapter 4 both record the same three basic temptations. Turn stones to bread, jump from the temple, worship Satan for kingdoms. But they put the second and third temptations in a different order. Matthew has the temple jump second and the kingdoms third. Luke swaps them, kingdom second, temple jump third. Is this a mistake? Did one writer get the order wrong?
This comes back to an assumption we often make, that historical accounts must always be strictly chronological.
Right, but is that always true?
Not necessarily. Think about how history books are sometimes written. A chapter on World War II might discuss the European theater, then the Pacific theater, even though events were happening concurrently. The arrangement is topical, not purely chronological.
Or even just telling a story to friends. Sometimes you save the most dramatic bit for last, even if it happened earlier in the sequence, right? For impact.
Exactly. We order things for clarity or theme or emphasis all the time. Now, looking at Matthew and Luke, neither writer explicitly claims, I am listing these temptations in the exact order they occurred.
Okay.
But there are linguistic clues. Matthew uses words like then, tot in Greek, and again, palin, which often suggests sequence.
So Matthew might be aiming for chronology.
It seems likely, yes. Luke, on the other hand, uses more general connectors like en, kai, and de, which don't necessarily imply strict time order. He might be arranging them thematically, perhaps building to the climax of the temple temptation in Jerusalem, which is a key location in Luke's gospel.
So Matthew gives us the probable sequence, while Luke arranges them perhaps for theological emphasis or narrative flow.
That's a very common and plausible explanation. The core events, the three specific temptations, are identical in both accounts. The different ordering reflects the author's different literary purposes, not necessarily a factual contradiction.
Okay, that makes sense. They're telling the same story, but structuring it slightly differently.
Right.
All right, last one. Number 56, cock-a-doodle-doo, twice. This is about Peter's denial of Jesus.
Yes, the rooster crowing.
So Matthew, Luke, and John all seem to say that the rooster crowed once, right after Peter had denied Jesus for the third time. Pretty straightforward. But Mark's gospel is different. In Mark 14:30, Jesus predicts Peter will deny him 3 times before the rooster crows twice. And then Mark actually records a first crowing after Peter's first denial, Mark 14:68, and implies the second crowing happens after the third denial. That looks like a direct conflict, 1 crowing versus 2.
It does look like one, absolutely. But again, let's think about levels of detail in reporting.
Okay.
Remember the sports analogy. Someone might say the game ended after the buzzer. Another, more detailed report might specify after the 4th buzzer sounded, signaling the end of overtime.
Ah, right. Both are true, but one is more general, one is more specific.
Exactly. Now apply that to roosters in the 1st century. It was common knowledge that roosters didn't just crow once at dawn. Yeah, there was typically a first crowing, sometimes called the first cock crow, often around midnight or the very early hours. It was less predictable, maybe less noticed. Then there was a second, more distinct and recognized crowing closer to daybreak, which was widely known as the cock crowing, a common time marker, like saying at midnight or at dawn. Jesus even mentions it as a time watch in Mark 13:35.
Interesting. So when Matthew, Luke, and John say the rooster crowed,
Yeah.
they might be referring to that main significant second crowing, the one everyone recognized as the cock crowing.
That's the most probable explanation, yes. They're using the common term for that time period, focusing on the final decisive crowing that fulfilled the core of Jesus' prediction after the third denial.
And
Mark, who tradition says got his information from Peter himself, might be giving a more precise, maybe even eyewitness-level detail account. He includes the less noticed first crowing after the first denial, and then the main second crowing after the third denial. It's possible Jesus even specified the two crowings in his original prediction, and Mark recorded it verbatim.
So it's not a contradiction, but different levels of precision. Matthew, Luke, and John give the main event. The significant crowing happened after the third denial. Mark gives the granular detail. There were actually two crowings framing the denials.
Precisely. Both descriptions cover the same time frame and the same core event, just with different zoom levels, you might say.
Wow. Okay. So as we've gone through these 6 examples, creation order, the death counts, the derricks, Jehu's motives, the temptation order, the rooster crowing, a pattern seems to emerge.
What do you see?
That what looks like a contradiction on the surface, well, often isn't when you dig into the language, the author's purpose, the historical context, or just allow for different levels of detail in reporting.
Absolutely. Time and again, careful examination reveals explanations that resolve the apparent conflicts without undermining the text's integrity. These alleged contradictions often turn out to be, you might say, fictitious rather than factual.
It certainly suggests that jumping to conclusions about errors might be premature. There's often more going on beneath the surface.
There really is. It reminds me of a story about a young man who apparently lost his faith over issues like these simply because he never encountered satisfying explanations, taking the time to investigate matters.
Yeah, it highlights the value of, not just reading superficially, but really engaging with the text and the scholarship around it.
Definitely. And maybe there's a thought here for you, the listener, to take away. Just thinking about how often in life, not just in ancient texts, we encounter different perspectives or accounts of the same event that seem to clash initially. Maybe the takeaway is to consider how those differing viewpoints, those varying levels of detail, might actually enrich our understanding rather than simply creating conflict. Perhaps exploring those apparent discrepancies, whether in the news, in history, or even in personal relationships, with a similar critical yet open-minded approach, could lead to surprising clarity elsewhere too.